Hi, Pablo. Thank you so much for the invitation to join the Cornell community today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm going to be sharing some of the insights from the recently published book by Guillermo, along with um, other individual and co-author projects that that refer to this um, transformation of organized crime, referring to criminal governance. I'll be sharing my screen now. Okay, good. I also want to thank Professor Kenneth Roberts, Professor Gustavo Flores Macias, who kindly also reached out and with such a generous invitation, together with Pablo, to participate in the speaker series in the Latin American Studies program at Cornell University. I'm really honored by the invitation. And as I said, this is a book that I recently published with Professor Guillermo Trejo, Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame. Pablo and I discussed about the relevance of focusing on the last part of the book on criminal governance, given that this is a new topic that is shaping political science literature on organized crime, given the the quick transformation of organized crime across Latin America, and probably something that has caught the attention of many recently in the media, seeing how organized crime groups across Latin America have been actually engaging in different forms of criminal governance. Probably many of you have seen how several organized crime groups in Venezuela, in Central America, but also in Mexico, of course, have been using different strategies, from enforced lockdowns to social assistance, medicines, food assistance to communities. So this is part of what we are trying to tap on that last part of the book, thinking about what's the logic behind those strategies. Is this new or not? Have we been missing parts of information maybe that we should be also paying attention? So I'd like to start off with some basic elements of the book that could help clarify the basic chapters, the logic of the chapters preceding that part of criminal governance, and help us get to that logic. And so I'll start by telling you just a little bit about the motivation. Let me start with inspiration, and I'm sure this is shared by many of you that study Latin America, that have looked into the Mexican case. The book starts in the 1990s to explain how the various forms of electoral politics in Mexico led to the transformation of organized crime. Since 2000, we saw a quick transformation of organized crime, and an increase in violence, but this seemed to be intertwining with key changes in Mexican politics, with the transition to electoral democracy, with party alternation, with decentralization. And what we saw from other disciplines is that if we looked into sociology, criminology, economics, um, organized crime groups were seen as private actors, more as interest groups, and so and to this extent, they were not really seen as apolitical. They were seen as apolitical actors, and so the way in which politics were as intertwining, not just about the political um, desires or interests by organized crime, but also the way that politics was intertwining with organized crime, was not as we considered as fully developed in the literature, and we hope to contribute to that. So a fundamental part of the book is a development of a theory of organized crime, and we are particularly concerned with redefining how we understand the state and organized crime. A common claim is that organized crime groups and the state operate in separate spheres, and that organized crime groups are non-state actors, sort of how Becker would see them from an economics perspective. So organized crime groups emerge in ungoverned spaces where state security forces are largely absent or ineffective. So this is a way to see it. Another way to see it is another dominant claim is that state and the criminal underworld are parallel entities. So state and organized crime are social orders that exist side by side. States and no organized crime groups rule independently, and so this is a zero-sum relationship. So whereas the previous view the implication would mean that you need is for the sphere of the state to become larger and larger, perhaps more police to make the sphere of crime become smaller. Also, to that extent, this other view, more from a sociologist's perspective, would also sort of tap into the key is having more state presence. However, what we argue and what many political scientists have also been referring to is about how the borders of sphere and state and crime can overlap. The key contribution that we're trying to establish here is to really tap into that area in which this overlap takes place, and this is what we call the gray zone of criminality. In this area, this is where members of the armed forces, the police, public prosecutors, directors of penitentiaries exist alongside with a variety of criminal organizations. It's an ecosystem of coercion, of corruption, of criminality. There are interactions between state agents and private economic groups that give rise to organized crime through the establishment of protection networks. And so I'm going to be focusing on understanding how this gray zone of criminality can change, how it can be have some shocks and become affected and then transform organized crime. So specifically, there are some political shocks that can affect this gray zone of criminality. On the first part of the book, we go into how party alternation can alter this gray zone of criminality, changing the stability of protection networks. And today I'm going to be talking more about another kind of shock, which is political polarization, that can also affect the gray zone of criminality. Protection networks can also have some sort of instability or can lead to greater competition among groups or between crime and state, make some of those state agents more vulnerable than others, and then experience major transformations. As you can see, what we're saying, we're trying to capture in this figure is that when there are shocks in this gray zone of criminality, there are processes through which the state and crime become confronted. They're confronting each other, and so in this process, there are not only confrontations between state and crime, but also even among crime itself. This leads to a process of what we call criminal wars, and criminal wars are crucial to what we're seeing across Latin America today. Criminal wars, the way in which today organized crime is competing among different groups that make up and that have multiplied over the past decade. This transforms organized crime. We're no longer talking about short-term confrontations. There are protracted conflicts that transform criminal actors, their objectives, their way in which they engage with the state, and the targets of violence. Given the rising number of competing organizations, then there's a need to diversify activities. There's a need to finance those wars, and so this is no longer about drugs only. This is about organized crime going into larger criminal markets, such as extractivist industries, control of civilian population, the regulation of economic activity. In this process, then it's no longer about controlling drug trafficking routes, but also controlling larger jurisdictions. Because it means that it is not only about controlling local governance, controlling just a portion of the market, but controlling larger communities, local governance in general, which means that organized crime become de facto local rulers. It is important to note that in this process, organized crime groups are not looking to govern. They're not like rebel groups, but they do seek to establish de facto controls. This means then that the gray zone of criminality, as I have shown you, is no longer limited to the crime and state. There's a major transformation in the criminal underworld in which society also becomes embedded in this overlap. Civilians become potential victims of the state criminal nexus. Since organized crime groups are not merely business organizations, but they are trying to shape public policies in favor of their illicit industries, this means that they are also affecting society and that they are also trying to shape society. And that's part of what we've been seeing actually throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, through this efforts of distributing um, social assistance or enforcing lockdowns. That's how crime, this overlap of crime and state, becomes also intertwined with how society plays out. So to understand how this has occurred, and we use the Mexican case to explain um, a key element of how organized crime violence has been transforming itself, but as I said, more recently on how it has been establishing what we call subnational criminal governance regimes. To explain this, I'm going to just go a bit back in time into 2006, and trying to first to explain why is it that states war against the Mexican states' war against cartels intensified violence. With this theoretical background in mind that I have shared with you about this overlap between crime and state, we can now discuss more about how and why the transformation of criminal groups in a protracted conflict occurred in Mexico. So, as I said, let's go back to 2006. That's when President Felipe Calderón from the PAN, Partido Acción Nacional, a rightist party, declared a war on drugs and against cartels. This happened again, after the most competitive presidential election, and in the context of a very acute polarization between the right and the left. The government launched 16 military campaigns across the country's most conflicted regions, and violence has skyrocketed. This is something that a very dear colleague from Cornell, Professor Gustavo Flores Macias, has documented very well in terms of how it has affected the way in which violence plays out, and most specifically, human rights violations. What we try to do in this book is to go into the politics of militarization. To understand that, let me give you some background on the Mexican politics, and because this is going to help us understand how is it that a different way in which violence is played in Mexico happened. So let me start out by saying the military intervention in Mexico took place amid a profound political polarization. So if we go back to the 1990s, there were some differences between the PAN from the right party and the PRD left party. They shared the side for free and fair elections, which created a space for cooperation. However, in the post-authoritarian period, the economic and socio-cultural dimensions became the battleground for the confrontation between left and right. The partisan conflict and political polarization reached a peak in just a few months before the election, where there was before the presidential election in 2006, President Obrador became a subject of impeachment. This was led by the PAN president back then, President Fox. And so by 2006, the presidential campaign took place in a context of high polarization between the left and right. Right after sort of sharing that desire for democracy, they were highly polarized, and Calderon's military intervention took place in that context. And so what we see is that in a context of acute polarization, in a transition to democracy in Mexico that didn't really reform judicial and police forces, well, it happens that a lot of the militarization reflected that environment of politicization. So where there was vertical integration, so the same party was governing at the federal, state, and municipal level, there was a possibility of containing violence, mainly because there was cooperation, the local government was empowered, and then cartels could be deterred to some extent. However, where there was political fragmentation, where you didn't have the same parties governing at different levels of uh, across levels of government, federal, state, and municipal, then what happens is that you would see that polarization playing out into conflict. A very clear conflict between the right and the left specifically, which meant that in very practical terms meant that the president was not cooperating with some national authorities. They were left unprotected when they were not part of the president's party, more specifically when they belonged to the leftist party, and they were vulnerable to violence. Cartels took advantage of that polarization and tried to conquer new markets. Let's say what I'm basically saying is that cartels could read those political messages of how the president was unwilling to help its partisan nemesis. So, in terms of evidence, what you see here is the first label refers to the party governing at the federal level, PAN, Felipe Calderón. The second label refers to the governor's party, and the third label refers to the mayor's party. What you see in this graph is that those municipalities that were were in states governed by the left, by the PRD, were experiencing 12 times more criminal violence than those that were part of states governed by the right. The most violent municipalities were in opposition municipalities in leftist states. So this tells us something, right, about that, how that polarization was playing out of the militarization strategy. But most importantly, this is saying something about the places where there were more vulnerable authorities. As I said, cartels could read this. And so what we see is that that vulnerability was being reflected in a new uh, uh, phenomenon of criminal attacks against politicians. And so this is the key question in which we can enter to discuss about criminal governance. We were seeing cartels murdering mayors and local party candidates across Mexico. But that distribution had a lot to do with this partisan logic that I was sharing you before. So between 1995 and 2006, we only saw a few attacks. But after 2006, there was a wave of high-profile criminal violence. It was after 2006, in this context of polarization, that we were seeing a substantial increase, but more than 350 mayors and political candidates that were being attacked by organized crime. These attacks were mainly concentrated at the municipal level. So you can see that more than 80% of these attacks were targeted against municipal level officials and municipal party candidates. And as I said, there was a partisan logic behind it. So despite governing less than 20% of Mexican municipalities, the PRD was targeted over 30% of the attacks. So this, to us, was telling us something about that partisan logic and how that vulnerability that the militarization had left behind for those leftist politicians was being read by cartels, and they were taking advantage of it. Also, it's important to say that these attacks were happening mostly during local election cycles. What this graph is showing you is precisely those dashed lines refer to the election years in those states. Elections in Mexico across states happen used or at least used to happen in different years, not concurrently with federal elections. So what you see is that attacks were happening more so during local election cycles. This is not about the federal election cycle. It's really about the locality. So, and it is also important to note, however, that organized crime does not target one municipality at a time, but entire regions. You can see that there were entire regions in the southeast, in northern Mexico. This was not something happening sporadically in some municipalities, but not in others. It was actually a strategy to establish more wider regional controls by organized crime. So I've shown you some descriptives that are very telling about this new phenomenon and what it means and how it looks like. But how do we make sense of it? So what we argue to explain why is it that drug cartels were willing to murder mayors and local party candidates? We say that when drug cartels were being engaged in this intense turf wars being shaped that were being shaped by this confrontation with states, and at the same time shaping levels of competition among organized criminal groups. Well, drug lords had incentives to launch attacks against local government officials and political actors to gain protection, to deal with that instability of the protection networks. And the great zone of criminality that was being that had this shock that our cultures were experiencing. Also to capture public rents, to control local government structures, and local populations and territories. Uh, at the same time, drug lords ordered attacks when it was possible to do so, such as when authorities are vulnerable and unprotected, as it occurs in regions where political power is vertically fragmented. Um, and cartels also took advantage of opportunities to colonize local governance, such as during local election cycles. But ultimately, what criminal groups were looking for is territorial control, and therefore they were attacking neighboring municipalities, which ultimately allowed them to establish criminal governance regimes. And this is where we get into the logic of specifically the logic of criminal governance. Um, when we talk about criminal governance, we are referring to those de facto controls that organized crime is seeking to establish at the local level over different dimensions of local organizations, including political, economic, and social life of neighborhoods and districts in your urban areas. If you see this recount that I've been guiding you through, I'm not referring about organized crime trying to control the country or trying to control the state level. This is about the local level, about municipalities. That's why we see more than 80% of those attacks being targeted at the very local level, at the municipal level. So these de facto controls are also trying to be established at the very local level. We have to think of organized crime, we argue, as a global chain of local operations. And to that extent, is that criminal governance is having a very local logic. So again, what we see is that we confirm that there was a partisan intergovernmental conflict playing out between the conservative president Felipe Calderon and leftist state governors affected mayors and local party candidates in PRD left states. Again, we see that mayors in PRD left states were more likely to become targets of attacks because murder became relatively a cheaper alternative mechanism of criminal control than bribes. There were specific politicians that were vulnerable, and organized could see that vulnerability could play it out in their favor. Despite numerous similarities to between two states, such as Michoacán and Guerrero, we can take advantage of these similarities to explain the timing of these attacks. And what we see is that Michoacán and Guerrero, for example, in southeast Mexico, despite sharing a lot of socio-demographic, geographic characteristics, even the same groups operating across both states, we find that their distinct electoral calendars had a major effect on high-profile criminal attacks. In 2011, it was an election year in Michoacán, and it had 8 times more attacks than in Guerrero. So again, this is about the places where it's possible to attack, and also the timing in which it's possible to attack. This is a crucial step. Next is to explain how organized crime was indeed transforming local life looking from these attacks. That's why we are talking about these attacks, because these attacks were crucial to shaping the way that local democracy is experienced by civilians in those places. From these attacks, it was possible to seize local electoral processes, to colonize municipal governments, to control local economies, and establish territorial controls. So let me go into that question. How do cartels use this targeted lethal violence against political actors to develop subnational criminal governance regimes? So how do we go from high criminal attacks to criminal governance? So as I said, cartels were seizing on the political vulnerability of mayors due to governmental partisan conflict, and the opportunities afforded by subnational local election cycles to target municipal figures and party candidates. These high-profile assaults then allowed them to influence local elections. In fact, that's why we are really interested in showing how those local election cycles were crucial, because it is at that point that organized crime can influence appointments, the way in which some policy proposals can play out, or some policy proposals may not even be feasible or part of the discussion. This is a point in which it is possible to penetrate new municipal governments in key areas. They can capture the share of municipal government budgets, access key information, such as a property tax, gain control of the municipal police. And I'm going to go through some examples to show you how this happened. Access to these government structures and resources, together with cartels' own military and financial resources, enable drug lords and their criminal associates to develop de facto control over local governments, populations, and territories. To understand how this happens, our research design looks into positive case studies where cartels have been able to develop subnational criminal governance regimes, such as Michoacán and Guerrero, and then look into negative cases where cartels did not succeed in becoming de facto rulers, and that is the case of Baja California and the eastern highlands of Guerrero. And I'll try to end up with a positive note, because I know that these are topics that usually depress us and it seems like there's no way out. So I'll try to share with you some experiences that could be can be revealing on how some communities have been able to deal with criminal governance. So let's start with Michoacán. We focus on municipalities and towns in Tierra Caliente and the northern regions of the state, with high values on vertical fragmentation. Michoacán is a case in which, in 2006, it was the first federal intervention at the request of Governor Cárdenas Batel from the PRD. So there was initially a good communication between the right and the left that was actually actually able to bring violence under control. There was a close collaboration between the federal and state government, which allowed the Zetas and La Familia, the local cartels, to hide, regroup, and rearm, and prepare for a protracted war against the state. And so there was a fierce battle, in fact, by 2008 between the Zetas and La Familia over the control of new illicit markets, and violence skyrocketed. In this process, that's where communication between the right and the left in Michoacan, with the left in Michoacan, the right of the federal government, really broke down. There was a conflict between leftist Governor Leonel Godoy and President Felipe Calderon that made the state and local politicians vulnerable to attack. In fact, this happened after a very clear attack by organized crime on Independence Day, right in downtown Michoacan capital city, Morelia. And then there was the initial communication that we had between the left and the right in Michoacan didn't go through after this confrontation, and in fact there was this cooperation broke down. What we call the Michoacanazo. There was an operation led by the federal government where that arrested more than 40 mayors, most of them from the PRD. It happened without really further communication between pan federal government and the left local government. It is important to note that, in fact, in Michoacan, after this intergovernmental cooperation broke down, was very clearly reflected in one of the most violent electoral processes in Michoacan. In 2011, more than 39 attacks took place in that local election. There was also voter coercion. There were anonymous messages on local newspapers and flyers to set the rules of the game, telling voters how to vote, how they were expected to, who was expected to win. Clearly stating that the PAN couldn't win locally in several of these municipalities. And so this is something that is part of the book. And then outside from a more personal agenda, in fact, what I've seen is that criminal attacks by organized crime against these political figures reduce voter turnout, which means this is a double threat, right? This means that organized crime can threaten politicians, it can also threaten voters, and ultimately what this means is that who has a power to define who wins elections is not really voters. It is about how organized crime is being able to determine how electoral politics plays out locally. This is the main concern that we have looking into 2021 next year, that we have elections throughout the country. All 32 states are going to have local elections of some kind. We can see that this is part of the great threat that we're facing in Mexico. So not only is organized crime being able to control politicians locally, but also by weakening this link between the electorate and constituents and politicians, it can have a greater ability to transform the way that governance plays out locally. So to explain more about how this has happened, what we've seen is that after this influence that organized crime has been able to have through local elections, then in the case of Michoacan, the Knights Templars were able to force mayors to surrender 10% of their local budgets. Actually, there are videos of the cartel sitting mayors one by one, requesting this access to the local budget. After these, it goes to the influence in which that can be exerted in other areas, such as the security apparatus. They have been able to take control over municipal police forces. And at the local level, we also know that there has been the possibility of taking over the production and marketing of limes and avocados. So to say this is about when we talk about criminal governance, this is not only about controlling the politics, but also about the economy. And then we in the book, we don't go into the social controls, but we know that there has been many different ways in which today organized crime plays out in the forms of social assistance, in the forms of violent lockdowns in the COVID-19 pandemic. But it goes deeper than that, such as disappearances, mass graves. This is part of how organized crime also plays out in the social dimension. Then we also look into the case of Guerrero. We focus again in towns of Tierra Caliente, northern regions of the state, and high values and vertical fragmentation. in Guerrero, what we see is again in 2006. There, Guerrero, we also have a PRD governor. Local leftist states also refused to recognize Calderon's victory, and after having heads beheaded, corpses being left outside of Mayor Felix Salgado Macedonio in Acapulco, Mayor Port in Guerrero. There was an open confrontation between the federal government and the mayor. The federal government sort of very well, not sort of, but actually very explicitly said that maybe there was some collusion going on, and that's why there were corpses being left outside of the mayor's office. And this again signaled to organized crime that the federation was not going to be willing to help out and come out to and reach out to a leftist mayor. So again, what we see is that after that, after again conflict plays out, political conflict is playing out locally, this is something that cartels can take advantage of, and we see confrontation between local groups that led to an increasing violence at the local level. Again, this just goes down the road into seizing local electoral processes, high levels of attacks taking place. And from there again, we see the way in which organized crime can affect politics, economics, and security. Being able to use the police as informants, being able to get information from the property tax registry, being able to extend extortion rackets against local entrepreneurs. Now, how can we? Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Just wait a second. My computer sort of froze a little bit. There. Sorry. So how can we make sense of this, and from a different perspective, also understand how this play out from other experiences? Well, if we look into the case of Baja California, this is a state and city that was being led by the right party, and we see a very close cooperation between federal, state, and municipal authorities. So this is a case of political coordination. Even when there were accusations, very clear accusations about protection networks among local police forces, we don't see that happening. We don't see the same thing as it happened in Michoacan, of having confrontations, being very vocal about how the PRD governors or governments were being colluded. In this case, that didn't happen. Actually, there was a total disregard for the accusations regarding protection networks that were being established among pan governments in Baja California. And so what we see is that actually criminal attacks were being contained. There was protection that the Federation was able to extend to these authorities, despite all these accusations and violence being very present throughout Baja California's history. Another case that we can take into account to how criminal governance has been averted is the case of the Guerrero Highlands. We see that there has been a powerful police force along with the justice system to confront crime. This is the Coordinadora Regional de Autoridades Comunitarias de la Policía Comunitaria, CRAC-PC. They are elected through local community assemblies to which they are accountable. And when at risk, translocal networks activate and they facilitate societal coordination. And in this case, again, attacks have been contained at to the minimum. So there is a way in which criminal governance has been averted, either because there has been some level of cooperation across levels of government. But also another case that is very revealing is the case of the Eastern Highlands of Guerrero, of indigenous communities that have been able to organize accordingly. And this is something that Guillermo Trejo, Shannon Matiach, and I have been working, and it's an ongoing project currently funded by the Guggenheim Foundation, but part of it has been already published in Latin American research review, in which we show that a key point in, or a key element for the crack PC system is first that there are internal and external controls. So at the police level, there are, you wouldn't expect much from police that don't have monetary retribution, that they have wooden rifles, short terms, at the same time having justice tribunals, right, that are elected through local communities, community assemblies, holding public hearings, no jail time, but still reintegration through community service and reeducation by community elders. And basically, to a large extent, this is because there is oversight and sanction, which is not something that we see very clearly happening in the formal judicial system in Mexico. So communal assemblies select respected individuals for their jobs. So this lowers the risk for corruption and increases accountability. When corrupted, there is oversight and sanction that are effective and are public knowledge, which links to an additional control, which is shame. If caught, corrupt police forces will face social shame. And at the same time, being selected as part of the PC is an honor, and members of the community police take great pride in it. So ultimately, what this means is that by communities coming together, that whenever they are in trouble or are facing threats, will come together through translocal networks to build information, to build solidarity. This means that police and the judicial systems are not captured by cartels, which is this is the case of Guerrero. This hasn't been the case in all of the indigenous world. In fact, in the Sierra Tarahumara in Chihuahua, they have failed to resist the narco, where they have been colonized by organized crime, recruited young indigenous men, and because there has been this lack of scale-up institutions through which community authorities can come together and can establish this oversight and social change. And I can go through this in the Q&A, but I wanted to highlight that there is something that is visible, that though it may sound like this is part of the indigenous usos y costumbres, or customs, it's not necessarily the case. I believe there are some important implications that we can learn for the larger Mexican system, and the implications of our findings with Guillermo Trejo on votes, drugs, and violence at the macro level, referring to how there is there's the relevance of creating networks of resistance. That this cannot be something that can happen by just some groups organizing, but that it is about the greater networks of resistance that can happen across municipalities. Because as you can see, organized crime is organizing locally, but building networks more generally on how this can play out. That scale matters, and also the micro level, that there are that there is also the importance of having a involvement across the community that can help increase accountability. Weaponry becomes secondary. This is about how policing can become effective if they can play a role in the relationship with police forces, which to a large extent has been missing in the reform of police forces and the judicial structures in Mexico. So just to conclude, I would say that cartels have been for long assumed to be apolitical actors. However, the evidence that I have shown with you today shows that during protracted criminal wars, drug cartels can indeed develop political interests. And perhaps because drug trafficking industry still imposes geographic restrictions, or because they cannot defeat the state in the same way an armed insurgency could depose a government, they're not gonna behave like rebel groups. However, this doesn't mean that they have the possibility of influencing politics. They may not have the interest to have formal power and scale at the national level, but they have the power to transform local politics. The result, this is not something that we haven't seen. Is very clear from the things that for the findings that I have shared with you today. But beyond that, we are seeing also more than 20,000 missing, more than thousands of mass graves, millions that have been displaced. That also are also part of the reflections of how this economic, social, and political controls that organized crime has been able to establish is transforming the way in which civilians live in many of these communities. So again, thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to the discussion and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for a wonderful and very interesting presentation. There are a lot of questions. We'll try to get to all of them. We hope we have the time. But first question is, do you think that under AMLO's presidency, we should expect more violence in the next elections?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's one of the main concerns and sort of lessons that we get when thinking about the 2020 election next year. Um, there are some elements to take to be worried about. First, there hasn't been a policy change for in the current Lopez Obrador presidency. There's still um, the policy approach here has also been from a military perspective. Um, so this is worrisome because it's not tapping at the local logic of organized crime. What this has enabled is the possibility of organized crime on how is still able to establish local controls. We have seen this in this year through the COVID-19 pandemic. We know of more than 10 states that in which organized crime groups have been able to violently enforce lockdowns, and at the same time also provide social assistance. So to the extent that that is happening, it's already telling us about the possibility of organized crime to do this, right? So this is not something that has changed over the past 2 years under Lopez Obrador. At the same time, the other concern is that we're seeing increasing polarization. There is a clear confrontation between organized crime, between the incumbent government Morena, and the opposition. And several governors today have actually confronted President Obrador, saying how he's taking away some resources. Today, actually, Eduardo Guerrero, if you want to read his column in El Financiero, he actually refers to how some the opposition governors haven't received the attention, help from the federation the way that Morena governors have received. So this is telling us about how the polarization argument that Guillermo and I advanced may actually still be playing out today, and how that could also be making some local officials vulnerable for the next election cycle. And so to the extent that we fail to look into that local dynamic and that polarization keeps rolling, I think that we might still have to see more violence and perhaps the most violent electoral processes yet. Ooh, your microphone, Pablo.
So sorry about that. So the next question comes from Ken Roberts. So the example of the Guerrero Highlands example is fascinating. Are there distinctive characteristics of these communities that differentiate them from others that have been less successful?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. There is something particular about the Guerrero Highlands, which refers to the history of social movement. In that a particular region that did not happen, for example, in Chihuahua. In the case of Chihuahua, well, we have the usos y costumbres in the same way that they play out in Guerrero community assemblies. The key difference is that there was no coordinating social movement process as it occurred in Guerrero, which we argue has been key in articulating this translocal networks that become activated as whenever organized crime has threatened their communities. So whenever one community is threatened, there's a sort of an activation of the rest of the other 11 municipalities that are part of the CRAC PC. And this is part of a long history of social movement in the region, which is not what has happened in other parts of the indigenous world. And so that is something important to take into account, which speaks again to about the community organization that needs to take place. In the case of Chihuahua, there had been, of course, social movements, but not in the way that they were sustained for a long time and nor coordinated across the region. I would say that's part of the argument that we advance in this new project.
Thank you. So this next question comes from Gustavo Flores Macias. My question is about the public safety prospects as Mexico's party system becomes more fragmented and parties increasingly come in and out. Should a more fragmented party system lead to less coordination and more opportunities for organized crime?
Yeah, thanks again for the question, and thank you again to Professor Robertson and Professor Flores Macias for the invitation and joining us today. It is definitely the nature of the party system today in Mexico. Is likely to play out in the possibility of coordinating policies. However, I'm still skeptical on how of a very, let's say, deterministic answer here, because despite that fragmentation, there are strong alliances that Morena has been able to construct with some parties, Partido del Trabajo, the new parties, PES, Encuentro Social. So just to say that maybe there are some alliances that could help to some extent, but at the same time, we know that these smaller parties do not control local. Do not control municipalities. They haven't been able to govern locally yet, and so to that extent, I would say that yes, there is there might be more opportunities to organize crime, and to say again, emphasize an additional point that it's not only about the fragmentation but about the polarization. So my emphasis would be on how polarization seems to be on the rise again today, and to that extent, I think that is the part that is worrisome about how that more conflict could be playing out, and again, more opportunities could be opening for organized crime.
Thank you. Another question relates to communal policing. Where should we expect communal policing organizations to form? Are they exclusively a rural and indigenous development?
Thanks. So it's not necessarily the case that this is only for indigenous rural communities. I think, however, there are good lessons there on how some elements could be replicated. What I was saying about the sort of the macro and micro implications, and how these relationships with the police forces could be playing out, and forms of accountability that could be worked out. That being said, there have been some developments in some urban areas in Chihuahua, some urban areas in Michoacan, on this new way of understanding of the relationship between police forces and the reform of police forces. However, that seems to be more of very local initiatives that local governments have been working on, and in which there is a strong sort of a stronger civil society locally becoming involved in this process. So it is hard. It is hard at the same time, of course, to replicate what happens at the crack PC. But I think there are very important implications there on things that should be talking about, specifically about how this is, well, this element of building police in collaboration with civilian oversight. It is also about how the police and judicial reform have to take place at the same time, right? It's not only about either or. It's about how we can think of them happening parallel in a parallel fashion. Of course, electoral incentives are not really aligned for that to happen. That's why we've been saying in their current president under López Obrador.
Thank you. Off to the next question. Have Peña Nieto and AMLO also refused to assist opposition mayors sick by criminal organizations?
Yeah. So for Peña Nieto, I don't have uh, evidence. That's something that we want to extend on right now, including the current period under López Obrador. But as I was saying, perhaps polarization was not as rampant as it is right now in the current at the moment, and exactly what we're saying currently under López Obrador, being very very clear about, right, the confrontations that he's having with opposition governors actually walking out from meetings, right, and from governors associations. That is very telling about things that are playing out, insecurity and other areas. Of course, our argument is not necessarily the case that it's only relevant for security issues, but I think it speaks to very important implications, right, in terms of life or death. That's what becomes so worrisome at that level. The same elements that we've been seeing that we saw in terms of who receives more aid, more security funds. That is something that, however, has been playing out under Calderón, Peña Nieto, and López Obrador. That others have been pointing out on that political aspect in the distribution, that we should take into consideration.
Thank you. So now I have a couple of questions on criminal governance. So we've heard how criminal organizations are increasingly taking over municipal governments. Do criminals rule exclusively by fear and violence? Do all criminal organizations exhibit the same level of predatory behavior, or do they take other steps to build some support and rapport with the population?
Thanks for that question. That's a fascinating question, and something that it's being explored more recently. There's a great piece by Professor Benjamin Lessing and in the Perspectives on Politics that is coming out and conceptualizing criminal governance. And it is important to say that criminal governance, of course, has the political, economic, and social aspect. Right? It's not necessarily the case that you have to see all three things being displayed to say that there's a criminal governance regime, right? It might be that you're only able to see one, and to that extent, it's also telling you something about other things that are happening locally, which I think is what we have been missing right now. When you see all in Mexico, at least, there was such a concern and lots of media coverage on how organized crime is delivering social assistance and amid the pandemic and enforcing lockdowns. Well, that is not something that should have been new for us if we had been seeing more than 300 politicians that were being killed by organized crime. That was already telling us something about how organized crime was attempting to establish those criminal governance regimes locally. But how, of course, it's hard to go into those in identifying the political, the economic, and the social aspects of criminal governance, and that's why it becomes, as a social researcher, it becomes really hard to get into that social aspect. Right? That's the great work by Professor Beatriz Magaloni having having to go through sophisticated research processes to actually go into this, because it's not as easy for people to tell you that this is what has been happening locally when they live under the threat, right, of organized crime. So first point to say that you don't have to see all three to say that that this is part of organized of criminal governance regimes. That one control, let's say, could be already telling you a lot of what is happening locally in that regard. Second, that there is a variation, right? Just as there is a variation in the kinds of dimensions that play out in criminal governance across different communities, there's also variation in terms of violence or non-violent practices. Um, in the Mexican case, I would say that we see more of a violent display because of the level of competition that this confrontation with the state has been forcing organized crime to consider. Right, there's a lot more competition, and to that extent, criminal governance, the attempt to establish criminal governance regimes also becomes violent because there's this high level of competition, which is not necessarily the case in some places in Brazil or in Colombia or in Jamaica, which is something that Professor Desmond Arias has been documenting in his great book, looking into how sometimes it can become violent or not, depending on the level of competition. And in places where there is a monopoly, it can be less violent. That's actually also the finding by Beatriz Magaloni in her more recent work. So sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's not, but we have to take into account that even when it's not violent, so bluntly violent in your face, right? There is a threat, there is a coercion that's taking place. So to say that, that's why I'm always really careful and not saying that organized crime provides public goods, because those goods don't have public character, right? Those goods are actually conditional on some kind of behavior taking place among civilians. And to the extent that that behavior and that obedience and that discipline takes place, then organized crime is not going to be as violent. But if not, violence can take place, and even when it's not violence, there's a latent threat, right? That it's there. So we can. It's hard to say that whenever it's non-violence, to say that there's no threat behind it. But just to emphasize that there's a wide variety of criminal governance regimes, and that we should be careful about the dimensions that we're able to document and reflect, because that may be telling us a lot more that we don't know, and that we're just limited as social researchers to actually go into and understanding what is like the full extent of criminal governance. And I think that's the challenge in this research agenda and in this quick transformation of organized crime in the last few years.
Okay, we have a lot of more questions on criminal governance, if you don't mind. So the next one is this a little more fieldwork oriented. So how does living under criminal dominance of municipal government in Mexico look like? Does all rule of law break down, or is it just life goes on? And alternatively, what about violence and crime? Do they stay at the same level or do they change?
Thank you. So it's hard to it, it's the I guess the puzzle for the Mexican case is that despite all these transformations, institutions have kept on going, right? We still see, we're still going to see elections taking place in 2021 next year, just as it has happened in many other municipalities in the past few years. I mean, there have been places in San Bernardo, Durango in 2013, there was just one candidate, and still the election took place, right? In 2010 in Tamaulipas, the governor, the candidate for governor from the PRI was assassinated just 1 week before the election, and still the election took place, right, with a quick substitution by his brother. And elections take place, and some voters get out to vote, and that's a puzzle. How is it that institutions can keep on going, right? Uh, uh, However, I guess that the next question that we should be asking ourselves is how do those institutions function after that, right? That's a key question there. Uh, it keeps going because we sort of have some protocols that are being established. I would question some of those protocols and whether to what extent we are missing right bits and pieces of information. I'm particularly intrigued by um, something that I think we haven't really documented very well, which I think that in the case of Colombia, and Arjona, Mario Chacon have been doing recently, looking into how this incursions of organized crime in elections is shaping who's willing to be candidates, right? How it's shaping the candidate profile, and then from there on, what kinds of policies we end up seeing. I mean, we have governors that have been soccer players, comedians, right? How what is that telling us about how, despite the fact that that institutions are keep on going, to how is that being shaped for the upcoming years, right? Um, I think there are a lot more questions in that regard, on how beyond those protocols that we have established, there's a lot more that is being shaped up, and so I mean violence violence can be taking place in different ways. Of course, there are communities where there has been explicitly places that have just been completely communities that have just been completely displaced. That's the case of the Sierra Tarahumara. Many of those communities, entire communities, have been displaced, and there's very violent encounters and experiences, and others in which there has been perhaps some sort of equilibrium, but equally threatening and violent. I would say that there is more that we still don't know, and that I think that not only social researchers, but that in particular very courageous investigative journalists across Mexico are doing great work in understanding mass graves and understanding disappearances, which I think that is a part that we haven't really understood fully on those social controls that organized crime is establishing. But as I said before, there is a profound violent experience in many of these communities, even if it's not violent right there. But I would say that it's very violent in general.
This is very interesting. I have another question on criminal governance. So, do criminal organizations place their own people in the municipal government, or do they prefer to keep and extort the previous appointments? And do criminal organizations establish their own municipal parties, or do they co-opt existing ones?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pablo. So there is a mix of strategies. In some places, as I was saying, right, in that election in Durango, having just one candidate is pretty clear, right? That there is a de facto election that is taking place by the local criminal group. In other places where there is higher competition, there's still a way to work around it and to try to influence one way or the other by different groups. So it's not an either or just one thing happening in general. There's a lot of variation still in what organized crime can do, again, depending on whether there's monopoly, whether there's competition, along with other elements that may be happening locally in terms of the politics and institutions that are set up, and the level, right, of coordination that could be playing out. So there's not just one strategy that has prevailed. There's wide variation, and that's part of what we still need to explain. So it's there is a let's say that there's a large research agenda there that we should be paying larger attention on what is it that they can do. However, I do think that it is during local election cycles that open up a lot of these opportunities, right, for what happens next. In some places after that, it is about how they can influence larger appointments that are going to be crucial in terms of security and information. In the case of organized crime, it's not as the kind of of the same logic as rebel groups, as I said towards the end of the presentation, where they can aspire to take control over the state, right? It is about how can they take advantage of those institutions and their weakness, because we cannot forget that in the Mexican case, this is happening after a transitional democracy that failed to reform the judicial and state institutions, that didn't go through a transitional justice process. So that's what we have to take into consideration to understand how is it that organized crime doesn't really have to play the party politics game, right? They in terms of international law, it's not as in the case of rebel groups that there's also an international some degree of international recognition that take place that is different also, that also plays out in a different way for them to aspire politically, when they can actually take advantage at its fullest of very weak institutions.
Thank you. So we have another series of questions. This is related more to electoral violence and coercion against candidates. So it's pretty obvious that, well, that many candidates have to run in the very dangerous races. But the question is electoral violence successful at coercing candidates? Have you observed any instances of candidates suspending their campaigns or withdrawing their names from the race? Is that something common? And alternatively, what steps do candidates take to protect themselves?
Yeah. So yes, there have been our data set. What it does is to take into account both threats, assassinations, and disappearances and kidnappings. And actually, one of the threats is really hard to get at, right? You really don't. They're not everybody's going to say I'm going to threaten, and you're not going to take all of those declarations as truthful, right? So there can be some credibility issues there. So what we did document for our project is precisely the places where where parties were not willing to propose candidates, and that was that has been on the rise for many of these local elections. Many candidates decided to decline to leave the electoral process, and in some places, particularly in that very violent election in Michoacan that I was sharing with you in 2011, PRD and PAN actually retired many of its local candidates. So being very explicit about we're unable to to appoint candidates in these municipalities, and that has been also on the rise. So along with those that are actually being able to run for office, some might be assassinated, but some might not even make it. So again, going back to the question before, Pablo, on how there is a pending question that we have sort of missed so far, and that hopefully we can start addressing, on how violence might be shaping our pool of candidates, right, in the first place, and how that ultimately shapes the kinds of policies, the kinds of democratic politics that can or cannot play out. We and then at the same time, to think about the what happens after that. I think that the cases of Michoacan and Guerrero for us have been very revealing on how you can actually go for many of the cases that we have on our database, go from the candidate was assassinated or was attacked, ultimately who maybe he or she was elected or not, and then from there look into threats to the local police forces. That's a case of Guadalupe y Calvo in Chihuahua. You can actually see there are 3 attacks happening, right, in previous elections. Finally, you get the election of one of the threatened candidates. Then, 1 year into the administration, all the police resigns, and then there's just one female director that ends up leading the police force and guess what, right? The rest of the population is actually being displaced, and Guadalupe Calvo today stands as one of those cases that has been conquered by criminal governance.
All right, we have one final question, and then we're gonna wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
So this question is: faced by the presence of co-opted municipalities, do presidents and governors isolate these compromised municipalities, or do they instead incorporate them into the policy making process?
Can you
My,
repeat that, Pablo? Can you repeat that?
yes. So the question is: faced by the presence of municipalities co-opted by criminals, do presidents and governors isolate these compromised municipalities, or do they instead incorporate them into the policymaking process? My question is from the point of view, just to make sure it's accurate, from the point of view of presidents and governors, do they ignore or keep these municipalities at arm's length, or they eventually send them budget and do business as usual?
Yeah. So I mean, from the period that we studied, it was clearly that there was a partisan bias helping those that were there that were partisan were partisans, and then not doing so with the opposition, right? And that is part of the reason to why we should be worried. We're not arguing either and neither for a unification of state police forces and saying, well, let's get rid of the municipal forces and there should be a mando único, right? That's how we have been. Talking about too for the more recent period. We should be worried about that because we have seen also. I mean, the dynamic of polarization and political conflict that we saw from the federation to the local state governments. It's something that can also happen from governors to and to municipal governors and mayors. The level again of polarization that took place was a very important element of how, after being threatened, they could just be dismissed. That's the case of Acapulco that I was sharing with you. The interior minister back then said, well, like it might be the case that the mayor is colluded with organized crime. Instead of going out and helping out and understanding what could happen, the implications that kind of announcement could have for organized crime, and that's actually what happened. I mean, organized crime went after the entire institutions in Acapulco. The property tax registry director was assassinated. I mean, that is part of how you can see the chain of actions that can unfold after high upper level authorities do not recognize these attacks, which is basically what has been happening, and unfortunately today, with this level of polarization and confrontation that President Lopez Obrador is having with the opposition, is sort of what is also hinting at us, right? That it could still be happening.
All right, Sandra, it has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.